Okay, we're good to go.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Emily Knight. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Really happy because Kelsey and I are here to go through an update on the state as well as federal election. And of course, my dog started barking right as I started, in case you can hear that. The work at home continues. But I did, I got up this morning and I thought, one of the things we talk to you a lot about is that we have these incredible partners at the National Restaurant Association. And when it comes to things like the House and the Senate, there are just no two better people that when I hear, or Kelsey and I hear the rumor mill circulating, we always go to these guys and say, okay, what's really true and what's not? And so I want to start tonight by introducing, some of you have not met them, but Matt Walker, who I call Mr. Senate, and then Mr. House is Dan Roehl. And so these gentlemen are the ones that I think as we progress forward, and we'll talk a lot tonight about what type of bill might be able to get passed before, mid-January, when the could be potential president change. I think we'll talk a little bit about that, but also just so you know, we can get into any questions you want. So I want to make sure tonight that we answer your questions. So in the chat box below, Anna and Joe are here as well, and they'll help us field questions. But if there's things that are on your mind, we're always an open book. If we don't have the answer, then we can circle tomorrow and come back to y'all. And so I think how we normally do it, and of course, Kelsey, I'm going to turn it over once they finish to go through the state. And we both were with the governor today, and I thought that was just a really good reinforcement of his support and the support that we have actually collectively going into the next session. So I thought I'd start with Matt, which I think is how we normally start, right, Dan? We'll go to the Senate first. And Matt, maybe, I shared with our members on Friday, just a little bit of how you walked me through, where we sit, some of the seats that, like in Georgia, which people are very interested in, and what you see maybe happening down the next couple of weeks would be great.
Sure. So there are a few outstanding. I mean, everyone's been hearing about Georgia, and Georgia is where the focus is. But just to sort of tie up any loose ends, there are still two other outstanding seats. One is Alaska, where Republican Dan Sullivan is in his race. He's widely expected to win that race. It just takes a time to count Alaska with all the rural areas. And similarly, the other one is North Carolina. Senator Tom Tillis is in a very close race with Cal Cunningham, who's a challenger. But again, in that race, if you look at the potential outstanding ballots that have been sent but haven't been returned back through the mail yet, and the numbers, it's possible that his opponent could win, but it's highly unlikely just based on the numbers of where they're at. Under North Carolina law, they can receive votes back from the mail up until the 12th of November. And so that's going to be outstanding, and that race won't be called until then, just because they want to hold off on making that official. Now, once you're done with that, where does that leave us? And that leaves us in the Senate at 48 Republicans and 48 Democrats. And remember, it's not a simple 50 split. So say that you pick up those two Republican seats that I was just talking about. We'll say that's 50 Republicans. The question is, if you have 50 Republicans, then what happens? Well, under the Senate rules, the Vice President of the United States also has a ceremonial role as the President of the Senate. But in that capacity, if there's a tie, then they cast that tie-breaking vote. So in this instance, Kamala Harris, if you follow the notion that Biden is going to be president, which I think is pretty clear at this point, although there are some disagreements out there, obviously. But realistically, that's where we're currently at this point. So these two races in Purdue are in Georgia are absolutely critical, and Republicans have to win at least one of the two to retain the Senate majority. And in terms of them, Georgia's very different than most states. They have a jungle runoff in the general election where every candidate runs. And so you can have 5, 6 Republicans, 7 Democrats, independents, everyone's in there. And if nobody breaches 50%, then the top 2 vote getters go to a runoff, which takes place on January 5th. And one of the races was Senator David Perdue against Ossoff, who is the Democrat. Perdue got 49.8% of the votes. That's the Republican votes, plus 2.3 if you count the Libertarian, would have put him at 52.1. So his official vote tally was 49.8. He just barely missed by 0.2% the amount he needed to reach that 50 threshold. But if you add in the Libertarian votes looking forward at this next election, you can say that probably around 52% of the people would have voted for him or the Libertarian. If you look at John Ossoff's votes between the ones that he received or other Democrats that ran in the race, he was at 47.8. And so you see that there's about a 3-point margin there, 5-point margin, depending upon how much you get. So Perdue did well. He won, but he hasn't won straight out. So he has to hold out until this next election to try to do so. Similarly, the other race is Kelly Loeffler. She's a Republican from the state. If you add up the Republicans who voted in that race, between the different candidates, you got 50.1% versus the Democrats that get around 48.7%. And so there's about a 2-point margin there. So what does that mean? What that means is that if both parties were to turn out the same amount of voters that they turned out before, or the same composition, the same numbers, and they each get out their voters equally, then the two Republicans should win that seat. And historically speaking, Georgia is a Democratic state. I mean, you know, the governor is a Democrat, the legislature is a Democrat. It is I'm sorry, I meant to say Republican. Wow. You can tell us later at night, a Republican state.
Matt, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, you're like, what's he talking about? Yeah, what happened? It is traditionally a Republican state, and it has been for a while. And so people think that's very good favor, and that does favor Republicans. Also, historically, Republicans have come out more in special elections, including recently. Don't forget that it was only a few years ago in Georgia that there were some really tough elections there where Stacey Abrams lost in the governor's race and others there as well. And so Republicans have a pretty good record with races up until this presidential election. With that said, this still is anybody's game. And that's very clear by the fact that, you know, right now, Georgia is right down to the wire with the president. And it looks like Biden's won Georgia. I know they're still looking at recounts and challenges and everything else. And the big change in Georgia is that since 2016, an additional 1 million people have been registered to vote in that state. So really think about that. In only 2 years, you have an extra 1 million voters. I mean, there are states in the United States that don't even have 1 million people in the whole state. And so literally the entire composition of a state just being added within a 2-year period to the voting rolls. And a lot of those people were recruited and were signed up by Stacey Abrams in the state. She's a Democrat in the state who's done an amazing job at the ground game. And so when we're looking at this election, what it's really going to be boiled down to is who's going to be able to bring their voters out on election day. I think Democrats are going to have a lot of benefits built in by the fact that they're going to have the president-elect that's going to be pushing for this. They're going to have Stacey Abrams in the state. They're also going to have their voters centralized because most of them are in the city. So it's a little bit easier to reach them and to get out there versus rural America. And Trump's not on the ticket this time, right? So the question is, do all these people who voted for Trump in the rural areas, do they get out? Do they vote? And there's reason to believe that they can and they will. And both parties are sending people now. Nikki Haley's going and Rubio and others, but we'll see. And that's really what's going to make the determining factor of who holds the Senate on January 5th is when that election is going to occur.
Wow. And so we'll know maybe January 6th, I guess. That
Yeah.
would be the hope. And then talk a little bit, one of the things we talked about too was, and I'm not sure people in Texas followed, was sort of what was happening with Puerto Rico and DC. And some of the decisions those voters or citizens made, and then how that could, you know, what could happen if the Senate did change hands.
Yeah, so the fear and the biggest concern is that, you know, the Senate has the filibuster rule, which says that you have to get to 60 vote threshold in order to pass legislation. And that's something that's been in place, you know, for centuries now. That's been there.
Yeah.
And the concern is that there's been a lot of push to eliminate the filibuster in the Senate if there is a Democratic trifecta and if they breach 50, because they'll have the presidency, the House, and if they get the Senate too, that they could essentially wipe away the filibuster rule that has the requirement of 60 votes. And if they do that, and that would be extremely controversial. It would change the entire fundamentals of what the Senate is and how it works, but they do have the power to do it. And they've threatened to do that, basically saying, look, it's time, we need to push more of the progressive things that we've wanted and some of the goals that we've had. And it could be life-changing in terms of political process, because one of the things they want to do is add DC as a state. And if you do, you get 2 additional senators, and add Puerto Rico as a state and you get another 2. And those are both heavily Democratic leaning, which means that you'd have a major Democratic advantage moving forward in pretty much every other Senate election. And it would be, it's very difficult to see if Republicans could come back from that. I mean, looking at the upcoming election cycles, certainly not next year, next election cycle in 2 years, and one after that too. I mean, this would be many, many, many years at best before there'd even be a chance for Republicans to come back in the Senate.
Wow. So I think we, as we sit here, we think it's sort of over, right? I mean, yes, there's some things happening, and just for everyone listening, we know that the election has been called and there's still moving parts. And so for us, as I said to you last week, our job is no matter who is in that seat, we have to make sure we're ready for the next session. So we sort of have plan A and plan B, and we follow the same news. We're fortunate we have maybe even better insight because of our teams on the ground. But we live and breathe like you do. But no matter what happens, we know one of these two will be in office, and so we've got to make sure we have a plan for the industry. And so we will ebb and flow, knowing that we don't have, at least on that seat, we don't have anything we can impact, but we certainly can be ready. And I think that's where we have to sit. And so we as an association, we're never going to get controversial. At some point, we will be given an official decision, official. But until then, we're just going to make sure that we're ready for either candidate to be in that role. So Matt, thank you so much. And maybe what I'll do is go to Dan, and then we'll talk a little bit about the lame duck session, because I think there's a lot of interest in, can we get something over the line? Especially, I know Dan and I spoke today, a PPP or something to help us get through the winter. One of our meetings today was really reinforced that we're seeing the numbers climb across the US. I think we had 1 million new cases today nationally. As much as we hope that things will start to calm down, it does look like we're going to have a surge. Texas is experiencing some of that. And so if that's going to happen, then what can we do in the short term to get small businesses through these winter months? Because just sort of hoping isn't going to be a strategy that works. So Dan, why don't you give us because I know the House was sort of a different night, one that maybe we didn't expect. So maybe give us an update on the House, and then we'll go into what you both think may happen in the next couple of months.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Good night, everybody who's kind of following along. In an effort to not be like overly repetitive of what you're already seeing in the news, let me just give you kind of a standpoint of kind of what we're looking at here at the association. Obviously, right now, there's still a bunch of House races that have not been called, but there frankly aren't enough out there where there's any suggestion that Republicans would take over control of the House from Speaker Pelosi. What we saw, and to Emily's point, which was, I think, a surprise given the polling data, et cetera, heading into the election, was where, a lot of the DC pundits were suggesting Democrats were actually in a position to pick up seats in the House, some even predicting as many as 10 to 20 seats. As of right now, Republicans have actually flipped officially 8 seats back their direction. Democrats picked up 3. 2 were basically gimmies thanks to a redistricting that happened in North Carolina. The only other one that's been called is a suburban Atlanta open seat. Obviously, Texas was a huge focus when it came to the House between retirements and some of the metrics that were happening in suburban Houston, suburban San Antonio, suburban Dallas, and obviously the Democrats were pretty much blanked in their effort to turn Texas blue, and in case some of these districts as well. Obviously, there's narrow margins in some of these races, but by and large, that's an important point. So by the time it's all said and done, there's still probably 2 seats Republicans are going to pick up in New York. There's a possibility of picking up one in Utah, and there's 3 or 4 that are really honestly still too close to call in California, because similar to some of these other states like Matt referenced, there's a lot of ballots that get turned in on election day that are collected by individuals. You can ballot harvest in that state, and we've seen this last cycle as well. It takes 2 to 3, honestly, weeks for some of those races that are too close to officially be called. So that's kind of what we're looking at. In the big picture, I think in talking to people on the Hill, Republicans do pick up a little bit more clout within conversations in the House, because Speaker Pelosi's margin has narrowed. But when you look at what happened in her caucus, you have several new, very liberal members coming in, 3 or 4 who defeated incumbent Democrats in primaries. So that was already going to shift her caucus further to the left. But obviously, a lot of the seats Republicans had picked off were first-term Democrats from really what were redder districts. And as a result, you're going to see a little bit more of an ideologically left-leaning House from a Democratic perspective. So that's going to be one of the challenges that the Speaker is going to have to navigate, is frankly a caucus that is more ideologically left-leaning than what she dealt with before. So with that,
And don't
Emily.
you think, I think, Dan, one of the things we've talked about is in some cases, and I've learned this, and Kelsey knows this, I've learned that Republicans are not all Republicans. You have different makes of Republicans, the same thing in Democrats. And I think we would think that on the House side, there may be even more division on the Democratic side than on the Republican. And so getting all those folks, I mean, I guess one of the things we've spoken a lot about in the last couple of days is sort of the notion of divided government, right? Is it better to have some type of check and balance with the Senate and versus one entire party where you almost swing erratically back and forth in any election cycle? And I think the same thing is that if, and I guess that transitions me to my question on any kind of relief bill, right? Because the number one question we get right now is, when can we get more capacity and is there any relief? And, you two have been in this even closer than we are. And I had some meetings today with different congressmen who've reached out that you guys work with, or senators who said, hey, we'd love to help. But we got nowhere, right? From August, September, October, it was like we just couldn't get something. And I guess maybe, and Dan, maybe you can take this with Matt's support is, is there even an opportunity? Because I know that restaurants and small businesses, won't make it through the winter if there isn't something. We can't wait till February.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. And, obviously I feel like this is the issue that we just have been struggling to get any kind of movement on, and particularly between the speaker and, Secretary Mnuchin, who, spent, I can't imagine spending 4 months talking about the same topic and not making any more progress, which leads me to believe that, there just wasn't an interest there in truly getting across the finish line. I'm sure Matt can add to this that, there's a dynamic with the Senate as well that's going to impact what happens here in lame duck. So let me say there's a couple reasons to be optimistic. There's a couple reasons to be pessimistic, and then there's a couple huge wild cards in this whole conversation. And in the argument for being optimistic right now, you have, and Matt can add to this, you have Senator McConnell, who I think has picked up a lot of leverage in this conversation now. He really wasn't a party to those earlier negotiations, but as still the leader of the Senate, who has come out and said, I think we need to do something before the end of the year, which was somewhat a change from where he was before. So you definitely have at the leadership level there, definitely a recognition and interest in trying to move something forward. From the House side, and some of this is played out publicly, you've seen some of these moderate members moderate members who lost races, who've really been frustrated by some of the headlines their more liberal, progressive members of their caucus pushed, and really feel that their seats were lost or almost lost because there was a focus on socialism or defunding the police, and that they weren't able to deliver any kind of assistance to small businesses, to individuals throughout the last 3 or 4 months. When you look at the return or at data out of the election, it's probably not going to be a surprise to people. The top two issues on people's minds were the economy and COVID. And, you had an opportunity to address in many ways both of those key priorities, and it just didn't happen. So I do think there's an element of Democratic moderates, et cetera, who really want to get across the finish line. As we were doing this, I was just reading Hoyer sent, who's the Democratic #2 leader in the House, sent out his memo about lame duck, and in there again suggests that we find a pathway forward. Now, this is where I go to my pessimistic side, and that was, conversations even between the White House and Pelosi for what started as a $3 trillion plus package that she ran through the House. It got as low as 2.2 in her mind, with the idea that, hey, I can't go any lower than this. And what you saw from me in the House was, I would say the vast majority of House Republicans, that was a bridge too far. It was too expensive. It was too much money for state and local governments. Definitely bipartisan recognition of the need to address our industry, Emily.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't just about restaurants. This was about, are we going to spend another $2.5 trillion? How are we spending that money? And, from schools, et cetera. The challenge, and if there is a reason to be slightly pessimistic, is at this point, I haven't seen any rhetoric out of the speaker's office to make me believe that she wants or is willing to go lower. Likewise, and again, Matt, I'll have a chance here. I don't see Senate Republicans coming up to that kind of a number.
Especially when they were at 500 million, right? I think that was the last, so maybe a trillion, right?
So then, the last two pieces are the two wild cards. The one wild card is President Trump willing to actually sign anything or work towards getting something done? That's obviously one wild card. If he decides he's not going to participate in this process, it makes it very difficult to get something across the finish line. Likewise, and I think this is a really important factor, is what does President-elect Biden have to say in this? I mean, usually we call it clearing the decks before a new president comes in. You try to take care of outstanding business. There's an interest in that party in having their new president start with kind of a clean slate on his priorities, as opposed to having to clean up the mess from a previous administration and Congress. And, I think the only way the speaker can somewhat save face is for Biden and his new team to come in and suggest it's in everyone's best interest to accept a lower number, or as you and I were talking about with Chip Roy, do you just put a couple of the 2 or 3 most popular bipartisan pieces together, like PPP program round 2, direct checks to individuals who really need it, and it may just be a bridge till after the election, or I'm sorry, till after the president is sworn in, when they can look at more of this. But the one thing to remember is that you still need at least 50 votes, even if they got rid of the filibuster, 60 votes to move a package in the Senate. Just because Biden's sworn in as president and Trump isn't there doesn't change the dynamic. You still need to get a package through the Senate. So there's a lot to play out here, and I'll make one quick plug for the role of grassroots and grass tops and the outreach everyone does to members of Congress. You guys have been amazing at this. There's a lot of very good changes that we've been able to make and drive in Congress, thanks to the efforts of, Emily, you and your team, and all of your members in Texas, whether it's with Chip Roy. I know Matt can say that for Cornyn, et cetera. Just some great leadership, and we're going to need to unfortunately continue that pressure and that level of engagement in order to try to get across the finish line. So sorry if that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, Matt. I'm sure there's pieces you can add to that if you want.
Yeah, I think you hit it really well. I just think for the benefit of the audience, it might just make sense because we talked about the likelihood of a deal, but we didn't really talk about what might be in it. So maybe just just in like 2 or 3, I mean, there's lots of different options. Another round of PPP is clearly what has the best chance of getting included relative to our industry. That's because it's something that has passed on a bipartisan basis multiple times. So you got something that the House, the Senate, Republicans, Democrats, the president, everybody's agreed to over and over. And so that's where we've got the best chance. The Restaurants Act obviously is out there. That's something that we strongly support and would love to see included. But we also recognize that at $120 billion, it's a tougher ask, and we just recognize that. Particularly if you're talking about the Senate bill being at $500 billion, it's about over a fifth of that entire bill, just that one piece. And so that's what makes that harder. But clearly there is, as Dan said, sympathy, particularly for our industry. So that's definitely still something to push for and that we're encouraged to try to do. A lot of stuff in the tax space. I think that there's good chances of getting some tax credit and some opportunities to help to have refundable tax credits for investments that restaurants make or have to make in reconfiguring their workspaces and personal protective equipment and basically all the stuff that you had to do due to COVID. Any of those things that you had to do to your physical space, training, whatever it is, there's chances of getting something in that space, as well as more tax benefits to help to pay for workers and others, and then some stuff in the lending space. And that's just a few of the examples. There's other stuff as well, but I thought it might make sense just to hit on what some of those pieces might be as it relates to our industry.
Yeah, and I think, for everyone, I know we're on Facebook too, and there's a bunch of people there, is just we're going to have to start the effort again. I think one of the things that's clear is all of our congressional delegation would say they heard from us like ad nauseum, right? But I think in a very good way, which was we would try to figure out problems together. So just beating them up every day, the staff, doesn't get you very far. But trying to work with them, like today, as Dan mentioned, we had Congressman Roy and Congressman Phillips working together today to say, could we create something around direct payments and a PPP? What does that look like? And so this is where we all kind of get together and then send it up to our friends at National and say, hey, run with it. But let them do the work, let Dan and Matt do that work. But our role is so critical that when we send you that, please send out this email. It is meaningful. I mean, when hundreds of thousands of letters go across the country, and we want Texas always with our size to be one of the biggest, it's noticed. And so I just want to make sure that we don't, now that the post sort of election fatigue, that we don't give way, because I do think we have this window, and you know this about the TRA, we're not going to not ask, because we don't, if you don't ask, you get nothing. And so for us, if we can get any momentum at all and try to drive that, there's no doubt this is going to get worse before it gets better. You can see that in the numbers, and we're going to have to try to get something. So I'm going to transition us to state, and Dan and Matt, I'd love you to stay on, just because I'd love to, maybe you can even, I mean, this is what I'm realizing, it's all interchangeable, right? I mean, it's not like you just live in a state and it's not connected to federal or vice versa. So we had a great night in the state of Texas. I'll start with that. I think what I'm most proud of is we met with our PAC. Kelsey worked with our two partner lobbyists, and really we sort of made a decision that we were going to change the way that we donated, and that we were going to try to give more to fewer, but really go after the races that we knew would make a huge impact. So proud, we're 19 for 19. The 19 candidates we donated to and backed, all 19 won their elections, and some were very competitive. And so I think what I'll give you all some encouragement, which is we are now going back and thinking about, is there anyone else, right, that we need to now make sure that we are in a great relationship with, or, I guess a better way to say it. But at least where we invested the money from our PAC, and especially in a tough year, really paid off in spades. And that will help us as we go into the next session. So Kelsey, why don't you just take us through a house, and maybe even the speaker, as that's becoming more clear since our update last week.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've said this before, but the theme of the election results in Texas really was consistency. We had record voter turnout, millions of more voters voted in this election than previous ones, and crazy amounts of money were spent here. And after all of that, we basically ended up in exactly the same spot that we were in before. So, in terms of the Texas legislature, there are 31 members. We had one flip from Republican to Democratic. That was very much expected. Frankly, we purposefully did not spend money in that race because we knew this was very likely to be the outcome. The interesting thing about that change is that much like Matt was talking about the filibuster in the US Senate, in Texas, we have a 3/5 rule. And so any legislation has to get the support of 3/5 of the members before it is recognized for debate on the floor. And with this one seat turning, the Republicans now are just shy of that 3/5 mark. This could play out in a couple different ways. Again, like the US Senate, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who presides over the Senate, has had this rule changed before. It was the 2/3 rule for many, many years until the Republicans lost 2/3, and then it became the 3/5 rule. So there's some talk that it might be changed yet again. They can change the rules with a simple majority at the beginning of session. So there's always some question about if that will change. But also he might not need to change the rule because he does have a Democrat or two who he's aligned closely with on certain issues. And then, of course, the vast majority of bills that pass in the Texas legislature are actually not decided along party lines. The vast majority of bills in the Texas legislature are bipartisan, in large part because, we're only in session every other year. It's a very short time frame. And so just kind of the pressure of session makes it difficult to pass a bill along partisan lines. Not to say it doesn't happen, because it does. But so all of those things are very fluid right now in the Senate. But again, consistency, it's still very much Governor Patrick leading the way in the Texas Senate. He's very conservative, and he still has a Republican majority. So a lot of the same in the Texas Senate. And the Texas House, again, consistency. One Democratic incumbent lost and one Republican incumbent lost. So there is net zero change in terms of the partisan divide. So that brings us to 83 Republicans, 67 Democrats. I will note there's 3 races that are currently within a few hundred votes of each other. So, we could see some recount efforts in those races, but at least based on where the numbers are right now, that's the partisan split that we expect. As Emily said, we're very proud of the folks that we donated to from our PAC, and to see them all returning is a really great sign for what this session will bring. We've got really strong allies that we've worked with over multiple sessions at this point, coming back to be in the Texas legislature once again. So that's really great news for us. Emily mentioned the speaker's race. This has really been kind of, for political nerds like me, almost as exciting as some of these other elections going on right now. It looks like we have our new speaker. Chairman Dade Phelan, who chaired the House State Affairs Committee last session. He is one who we donated to before this election because frankly, he's been a huge supporter of our industry. He came and spoke at a board meeting back in February, I believe. And then he also was on one of our webinars with us when we did sort of a coastal edition. And he's someone who frankly is young, is really hardworking, is smart, and listens. He is a former staffer at the Texas legislature, which I'm always partial to. So he very much knows how the process works, how to reach across the aisle and work in a bipartisan fashion. He's certainly not what I would call sort of a political extremist. He's more moderate, more of a problem solver. And he has a lot of allies, as we saw. He entered the speaker's race and within a few days announced that he had enough votes to win. And he truly put together a coalition of Republicans, Democrats, new members, veteran members. It's a really interesting, diverse coalition. He also today started sort of acting like speaker. He appointed a work group of legislators to study and make recommendations about how to run the legislature with COVID. So that'll be a very interesting process. As you know, we've kind of been warning that this session is going to look very different. The Texas legislature is what I would call technology averse. Zoom meetings are not sort of their bailiwick. So there's been a lot of questions about how does that body do its business when you have social distancing and kind of heightened sanitation standards. Typically they have hearings and pack in hundreds of people in one small room waiting for hours to testify. Clearly that's not going to work this session. So we're certainly going to follow that process closely. But it was just one more sign that, Speaker Phelan is confident and ready to go and ready to lead this body next session. So that's kind of an overall summary of where we're at. Emily, I'll turn it back over to you. I did see one question for Matt and Dan, but Emily, do you have any other kind of state updates before?
Yeah, no, I think we can talk a little bit about, I think from a state perspective, and I think maybe Kelsey share a little bit, the meeting we had with Governor Abbott today. It's very clear he knows the industry. One of the things I will mention that's important for all of you is that as the numbers start to increase, we have the hospital regions, as you all know, and so the El Paso region is at 50%, as well as the Panhandle and Lubbock. And so once you're above 15% of a hospitalization rate for 7 straight days, you go back to 50%. Most of our restaurants, I was in some conversations tonight on the drive home from Austin, they're not even above 45 because of the 6 feet, right? So that doesn't alarm me as much as when I'm looking at some of the numbers in El Paso of just the people in hospitals and what's happening out there, right? It worries you just because of the number of people impacted. But I think what is happening out there, and this is important for all of you, is that there is a county judge who ordered a dining room closure, and that goes against the governor's order. And I think we've been sharing with you that we've been very much a part of this with our chapter in El Paso. And likely what's going to happen is it will get appealed to the Supreme Court, where we expect it to be overturned. Why is this important? Because as long as the disaster declaration stays in place and governor's order is a statewide order, it means that individual things cannot change from that order. So you can't be in a location and have local authority change what's part of the governor's order. And we believe that's critically important as we could be entering this next 4 to 5 week period. That could be very challenging for us as the numbers rise in maybe some of our other cities. And so, we're watching this closely. There may be even some things happening tonight we can report back on, but we're trying to get it to the Supreme Court as quick as possible so we can, maybe put a tag in this and move on. But that's one of the things locally to the question that came on, which was, what can we expect, I think, Kelsey, in a Biden administration? And I think there's a number of, everything from, I know my daughters were like, what's going to happen to our school lunch food, right? Because they go back to when Michelle Obama was engaged in the school lunches. Like, is our school lunches not going to be good? And I guess what 14-year-olds think about. But I do know there's lots of things like, nutrition with restaurants. There's, the menu labeling kind of stuff. There's lots of things that we want to talk about outside of taxes, right? That we need to start thinking about. So I don't know, Dan and Matt, if you want to take that on. And I think we'll get away, the mask mandate and all that. I think we just, there's a lot of rhetoric around this right now, and masks have become so political, but there are some really significant policy, I think, things that we would maybe believe he would go after or want to engage in. So maybe you two can share.
Dan, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start, because there's a point that I wanted to make based on
Perfect.
something that was mentioned earlier that occurred to me after I said it, so I want to make sure. In terms of the discussion, a lot of what happens next is going to be based on whether or not Democrats do have a trifecta. And I want to be careful because, I thought back after I said this, I don't want to leave people with the impression that we only work with Republicans. We've got some very good Democratic friends who we work very closely with as well. And many, in fact, we supported Democrats that are pro-business and pro-restaurant.
Absolutely.
The concern, though, with the trifecta is that anytime that one party has all the power and unchecked power, that it can create a lot of problems, right? And it can pull you to the left. And particularly in this instance with the progressives in this instance, it's very clear that they want to do some very big and bold progressive things that may not be favorable to our industry. So the short answer to your question is, it depends upon who's in control of the Senate. If Mitch McConnell is in control, then you got to work for things that are doable. And I think that Joe Biden and McConnell have a very good relationship and a very long history of actually working together on deals that they can do. And in some ways, I think that's going to be beneficial. If not, then actually it's going to be hard for Biden in another way, because he's going to be pushed very hard by his progressive members to go out and do very progressive things. So let me get a little bit more concrete so I can give you some examples of what I think short term either way. In the short term, the first thing is COVID relief. I mean, even if they pass something now and it's something small, they will probably have to come back in a few months and re-examine and decide what more is needed and what areas and where they're going to target those. That's something around the corner. The ACA, the Supreme Court is going to be making rulings soon that could make the Affordable Care Act essentially get wiped out. So if that does occur, they're going to have to think about passing something right away, at least the things that they agree upon. So for instance, something to protect people with pre-existing conditions and stuff like that. And so that will take up some time and some focus. Regardless of what happens, you can expect that right from the outset, Biden will spend a lot of time on executive orders, things that he can just walk in day one and literally sign a pen and it's done. And he turns back a lot of things and changes things. And then the regulatory side as well.
I think we got a little hint of that today, right? Which was sort of the Paris Climate Accord, DACA.
Exactly.
There was 4 things already today. He's hinted that on day 1, he will, either reverse course or eliminate that executive order from the past. So you're right. And I think there's going to be a stack more. What are your thoughts of things around the controversial topics, paid sick leave, minimum wage, the tip credit, the kind of the things that we're, always trying to find a balance, right? Because we know we don't have great restaurants without great employees, and there's always this balancing act we're trying to go after.
So I think paid leave is a good example. There is broad bipartisan support to do something in the paid leave area. That's not just a Democratic issue or Republican issue. I mean, there are Republicans that want to do something in that space and Democrats as well. Now, there's differences of opinion on what it might look for, who pays for the paid leave. Is it paid by taxpayers, placed on the businesses? Is it picked up in some other way? Is it voluntary or involuntary for businesses? There's a lot of pieces, but people want to do something. And that's only been magnified with COVID, right? Because people do want to make sure that people that get COVID are taken care of. And so you could see something in that space. Wage, again, if there's a trifecta, then wage is going to be one of the very top issues to get done on the Democratic side. If Republicans have the Senate, I think there will be a push to slow that down a little bit, particularly right now in COVID, with the idea that it may not be the right time to jump up. And certainly if there is a wage increase, to be one that would be deemed more reasonable and one that restaurants and other businesses could accept, something that's more modest, more gradual, that is something that could be phased in, that industries could actually possibly get behind if there's Republicans. And so that backstop is going to be critical in that space. Immigration reform, DACA you mentioned, I can see some stuff on the margins there, although it's going to be tough to get to an agreement because of the border security issue, and that's going to be a big issue there. A lot of stuff in the workforce space, though, a ton of stuff to get increased help for workers, to try to increase that side, and tax incentives and others for businesses that are doing worker training people for the new economy and things like that. And that's an area where we can work with Republicans and Democrats together as well. The labor space, though, is certainly going to be tough. If there is a trifecta, particularly, you're looking at, the joint employer stuff and unionization and liability for businesses, and that stuff will all, substantially increase. Dan,
Yeah.
additional
Yeah,
thoughts?
I mean, I think Matt's hit it right on. I mean, Joe Biden, if on the purely in the labor space, is probably the most pro-union president that's ever been elected. And when you look at some of the stuff he talked about, it's right in line with what Matt's saying. I will tell you that, the only other two pieces I would throw in there are, one, enforcement. I mean, you'll see a much more active administration when it comes to enforcement of various policies. So I would definitely, that's something they can actually tangibly do. And then the third, which we haven't had to, or the second, I'm sorry, we haven't had to deal with in a while, is that, when you're dealing with stuff at the state and local level now, you're going to potentially have a Biden administration labor secretary showing up to help support or push policies or rhetoric around those. And, it's going to try to drive a narrative around them that is going to eventually impact state and locals. I agree with Matt, unless there's a trifecta, you're not going to see, $15 minimum wage being passed into law at the federal level or some of these other pieces. But the extent to which there's kind of rhetoric in that space and, a push to do that, it could be driven with a more coordinated message out of DC and administration. One of the questions that came in from Facebook here was specific to kind of what to expect from an administration around, or the new administration around, shutdowns or, impacts to restaurants. And the short answer is, I don't know that we completely know the answer to that. I know, our boss, John Kennedy's been talking to the Obama transition, the Biden transition team. And quite frankly, this isn't a new issue that we've had to deal with. And, Emily, you and your team done a great job engaging with the governor at the local level. A lot of these decisions are obviously in the hands of local elected officials. And, with the advice from you and your colleagues around the country, it's partly why we pulled together that, reopening guide and the safe practices and principles. The idea and the hope was that, working with federal leaders, with academics, we could set a course that would be, largely followed throughout the country and more uniform. And that's certainly not what we've seen. And we've actually had to do a call with our, food safety professional team, with our CEO, with Dr. Birx, who at the time was traveling around the country saying, I'm not sure people should be going to bars and restaurants. Well, okay, there's a big difference here. And, there just isn't the evidence that you're suggesting. We've obviously had to counter CDC putting out correlation studies, looking at people and saying, hey, these people got COVID, what were they doing? Well, not surprisingly, they weren't sitting in their houses. I'm sure you could correlate that as well. It wasn't a causation study, but yet, once again, it was quoted over the weekend in a story in, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. So, there's no question that I think President Biden wants to see some enhanced compliant measures, particularly around mask usage. But, I think my hope is we dial down the rhetoric. We do let reasonable, and I'm going to say reasonable science drive this. I think the president's been right at times that if it's just the health professionals and their pure goal is to eliminate it, we're all going to be sitting at home. We have to take a calculated approach to this whole process. So yeah, we're going to absolutely be talking to them. He obviously announced his 12-person COVID task force. We have a couple people on there that I think we're familiar with and are going to keep talking to about, hopefully having a responsible rhetorical approach to this. But I maybe you feel differently in this, Matt, but I think it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where he's going to come in and issue national mandates. I'm not even sure he has the authority to do it, to be totally honest. So.
Yeah,
well,
no, and
I'll add, if he tried to do that, I can all but guarantee Governor Abbott and others would push back hard against that quickly.
Yeah, and there's limitations on what he can do legally and stuff too. And where you'll see him do it is by using federal government levers as leverage against states to get them to do it. Like, you don't have to do this, but you're not going to get as much money as you don't, right? So you think about that in terms of back in the day when people wanted to have speeding limits, and they wanted to have speeding limits set at 65 miles an hour. States have the ability to do it. You could be at 75 or 85, but don't expect to get federal funds, right? And so there's ways they can do it by holding back money and holding back opportunities and others from other states. But you're right. I think that politically would be very tough for him too. I think that what he'll do mostly is use a bully pulpit to try to convince people that it's the right choice and convince them to make that decision. Because particularly coming in, he doesn't have a very big mandate. Let's remember, I mean, it was not a good night. I mean, the presidency was won, but if you're from the other side, there's not a huge mandate out there. And so I think that he's going to try to be reasonable in that approach as best as he can.
Yeah, and I think we have to keep sorry, Dan, we just have to keep telling our story. I mean, I think that's we were in a meeting today where a very senior person said directly, everything we're getting back from contact tracing is people are getting this at their home when they have people gathering. Right. And so we worked on an op-ed, Anna, who you can't see, but helped Kelsey and I, we crafted an op-ed that really encourages people for Thanksgiving to go dine at a restaurant with their family and then bring a meal home for someone. And we're working with our Council of State Restaurant Execs on this as well. And we're trying to say, listen, you keep saying the evidence doesn't show that this is happening in restaurants, but you keep dialing back restaurants. Mm-hmm. So in a place like El Paso, where they were forced to close, in my mind, illegally, you've only seen the numbers increase. So we don't even have the evidence, and yet that seems to be the go-to strategy, right? And so that's when I really do say, thank God we live in Texas, because in a way, I know that our members aren't always happy with how this is played out, but when I compare us, and you have this view even better than I do, we are so lucky compared to so many states where my friends, they're still not open, or they were open and then closed abruptly. And I don't think you see that happening here.
Agreed.
We're lucky.
Agreed.
Dan, I cut you off, so I want to make sure you.
No, I agree with you. I mean, we get it, right? The issue that we're challenged by is the fact you can't eat or drink with a mask on. That is the number one challenge. It's partly a perception challenge, which is why we've looked at whether or not we need to be going out to try to better get data on this as a way to really influence what those decisions look like. And I've seen data in other states that show the same exact thing you do, Emily. The number one form of transmission is from large house parties.
I mean, we hear it every day now. We heard it today. I mean, our data shows this. Okay, so then why are you limiting restaurants? Because if you destroy small business, what do people have to come back to when they return, right? Yeah. I mean, there's going to be nothing left.
Well, and you guys are, a little bit fortunate in Texas. In my home state of Wisconsin and Matt's home state of Maine, I mean, outdoor dining isn't happening very much anymore. And, so it's kind of a double whammy as you're losing that outdoor space. And at least in Wisconsin, I think it's been well publicized. It's the COVID situation is obviously not in a great spot. And you're seeing, again, dining rooms being closed or shuttered. And I think it was Illinois where the governor ordered them all closed.
All closed. Yeah, and I think, and I know as we're limited on time, a couple of other things I thought about, right, it was around nutrition and sodium in restaurants and menu labeling, which, I know we've already been through that journey. Plastics, right? You think about Kelsey and I are engaged in some conversations now. You can imagine that emerging again as a discussion point. And we know that plastics have not decreased in restaurants in the last 8 months. They have probably tripled because of curbside and delivery. And is that going to be something around plastic bags and delivery containers? And so I think what we're doing to give our members some confidence is we're thinking through these issues now. And as Dan and Matt said, this isn't the first time that we have had a Democratic president. And so there's some of the issues we know, if it's labor or it's things like nutrition and, the different calorie counts of restaurant food and some of those things that come up in the past, there's not that there's a complete playbook, but there are things that we can start to prepare for. And realizing at the same time we have state issues, and some of the things that, I think that Matt mentioned around labor are things that Kelsey, and I know we don't want to get into too many details, but there's some very big coalitions being formed and have formed that are working on some really important legislative priorities that, of course, TRA is part of. And so we won't be the tip of the spear, but we're a very big part of that coalition. So Kelsey, I don't know if you want to share anything around liability.
And I would add too, one of the kind of reassuring messages that I took away from the elections in Texas is I don't think it's a surprise that incumbents did well, because we had a really successful legislative session prior to that. And how I'm defining success here is, they made a historic investment in public education, which was, very popular, Republican, Democrat, urban, rural. It was one of those issues that really both chambers rallied behind and did something big. And it's also the kind of issue that, again, is not a partisan issue. It's one that was really seen as a needed investment for the entire state and also for workforce development, which has come up a couple of times on this. And so, I think what's nice is we had kind of that mandate going in. The legislature was able to come together in a bipartisan fashion and do something big on it. And then they were rewarded at the polls by being reelected. And so I think that sends a very clear signal to our legislators that people want solutions. They want legislators to show up, to do the work, to reach consensus and agreement, and to not spend all their time sort of bickering and pointing at the other side, right? So I think that's a really good sign. I think when you combine that with the fact that we have really big challenges as a state right now, there's this thing called COVID happening, so that's taking up a lot of time. But it's having a massive impact on our state's budget. Not as bad as many other states. This is another theme of the night, because Texas has been saving money and making smart investments, but still they're going to have a budget hole to deal with. They have to do redistricting, which comes up every 10 years. It tends to be incredibly divisive and take up a lot of time, and COVID and the economy. So when you add that with education and healthcare, which are kind of two other big issues that will be important with COVID, there's not a lot of time to deal with all of these other minutia things that special interests are really agitated about. So I think for Texas, that's good, because we want our legislators focused on the economy, focused on, just making Texas a safe, good place to live, right? That's sort of the things that most Texas voters want. And when you look at our agenda as the Restaurant Association, it really nicely fits within those buckets, right? We want to do things like make alcohol to go permanent, because that's a huge revenue driver and it's something that our consumers want. So that fits nicely within this rebuilding the economy framework. As Emily mentioned, we're working with diverse coalitions that really represent all different kinds of employers in the state, to deal with some things like wages, but really to deal with the uncertainty, right? Texas is a huge state. El Paso is very different than Lubbock, is very different than the Valley, is very different than Dallas. And so the business community at large, including restaurants, are continually saying to the state, please give us some certainty, some predictability, so that we don't have to have these same fights in 254 counties. So we'll continue to work with those business coalitions. As Emily said, we're not going to be the tip of the spear, but we're really going to be locked arms with other employers, which amplifies our voice, frankly, is a much more efficient way for us to do our work. And it allows us to focus on those industry-specific things like alcohol to go, where we can really get a lot of bang for our buck. So it's a long agenda. I know y'all have seen it. and seeing our pleas for traction and all of the other sort of grassroots activism and engagement that we all, every person in these boxes here needs in order to be successful at both the state and the federal government.
Yeah, and I'll leave, I'll kind of tail off a little bit what Matt said, is that what makes this job so great is that it is a bipartisan organization. And so what allowed us to be successful in our PAC giving was giving on both sides of the aisle. And, Kelsey and I've had a chance to sit down with Democrats and Republicans. And the one thing that's very clear is they all love restaurants. And so instead of getting into what side anyone's on, we just continue to carry the message that before this hit, we were the second largest employer. We contributed 70 billion in revenue, right? Massive amount of tax revenue. We employed so many people that frankly, our industry was the home where they could get a job. And it's just a meaningful industry with 50,000 units across the state. And so to me, we don't really care if you wear an R or a D. We care that you care about restaurants and that you want to see restaurants grow. In our meeting today with Governor Abbott, one of the things he shared is that there's an extraordinary high number of very large companies over the next year. I think he said, Kelsey, it'll be the highest that we've had ever in Texas, moving to Texas. And we all know, what does that mean? Well, if we're 51% of the food dollar before the crisis, and now arguably maybe 47% cents on the dollar, you got to have restaurants. And so all of that growth and all of that demand coming into the state should fare, very well for us. And I think we've just got a plan to get through the next 6 weeks. We are set up beautifully for next session. We're going to need everyone's support. You can see with Dan and Matt, we have incredible partners on the ground, and they've got a team up there that this is what they do every day. And so you should have all the confidence in the world that we've got you covered. And right now we'll let things play out as we always have. We'll tell you when things change. And know that, Joe and Anna, who you can't see, are with us, and we're going to get through this, and we're going to have clarity probably sooner than later. And whatever you need, to reach out. And if you have questions federally, just come through the TRA, because you can imagine if these guys got every state calling them. But we're going to begin tomorrow, likely working with 2 of our congressmen, one on each side of the aisle, and trying to get something going on a PPP that we may be able to pass. We don't know, but we're going to try. So Dan, Matt, thank you so much. You guys are amazing. Appreciate so much, especially with the short notice jumping in. Kelsey, obviously, thank you so much. And Joe and Anna for keeping us on track and running these for us. So we'll post it for everyone who couldn't make it. And Dan, Matt, Kelsey, anything before we sign off?
I had one alibi. I'm sorry. I noticed in the comments someone just posted now. They asked if anyone knows of a Democratic senator's posting an all plastics ban and et cetera. And that's legislation that was introduced by Tom Udall, a Democrat from New Mexico. He actually just retired, and Alan Lowenthal, who is a Democrat from New York, and it would ban single-usage plastic products. It would ban the construction of facilities that make plastics. It would put forward a nationwide deposit system for plastics and others. To answer your question, the person who introduced it is not coming back next Congress, but it does show that there's people that are pushing for more bans in that space.
I'll just to give everyone a little bit of confidence. Kelsey and I are on with a government coalition. What is it? Council of Governments.
Yes, one of the COGs.
Yeah, one of the COGs, which is sort of new to me, but I love that we're in the discussion. So we met with them, I guess, about a week ago. And one of the things we're thinking about is, in order to help contribute to the work they're doing, which is a 3-year EPA study grant, is, for example, opt in to condiments and silverware when you have to go carry out, right? So instead of, I don't know about you, but I get one particular company, which will remain nameless, and I get like 40 of these condiment plastic containers with lids. So, one of the things we could do is opt in. Well, I love that because it's great for you, and it's great as a restaurant owner, and it's great for the environment, right? So that's something, so there is a lot of common ground. I think the immediate just slash and ban is sometimes a challenge, but I do think there's ways that we can also help to make you all profitable while we make sure we represent business and industry in these discussions, which we are doing. I had a long
and I'll
day
say on top of that, the answer can't just be no, 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 no. We have to come with solutions on some of these. The pandemic's clearly paused the direction of some of these mandates. I think that, that Udall bill is a bridge too far anyway, but it's not to say there wasn't, and there will be additional momentum around packaging and single use. And frankly, there's going to be people within our own industry who are going to be leaders on that, and that'll also help drive that. So.
Yeah,
that's right. And I think consumers too, where I'm in Austin, the Socialist Republic of Austin, and But that's often what consumers are asking for. And that's also driving innovation in the packaging space and within restaurants themselves. So, I think Dan's exactly right. The answer can't always be no, no, no. It's help us help you get to a workable solution.
And our job as the association, both national and state, is to make sure we're in those conversations.
Yeah.
Because what we never want is a mandate where we actually didn't participate. Because like that one call, we were able to talk through, it was actually Chris Pappas, who I give a tremendous amount, Papados, the whole Pappas restaurant group, and you opt in order to get those things, right? What a great idea, because it saves you money if it's just throwaway items, and it saves the plastics they're going into, I guess, wherever. I know I got an hour lecture on it, but to me, it's like, that's a great win, right? Everyone wins in that. And that's what we're trying to create, because Dan's right. We're in a world now where we just can't say nope and then fight against it. We need to be able to have compromises, and then we actually get things done. So I think you'll see us do more of that too in the future.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, I know we all have kids to either do homework or go to bed. So
Not all of us
Kelsey's like,
do.
no, I have geometry
Some of us just have
homework.
loud dogs.
I saw Dan's daughter stop in. I'm like, it's a nice thing about, Zooms is we can all see each other in real life. So
Yeah.
thank you guys. Have a great
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
All right. Bye.
Okay.